another old Martin with some history. This is another D18, this time from 1954. We're into the mid-century boom of American manufacturing. Got the introduction of leisure time, and television is bringing musical acts of all kinds into the warm bosom of newly constructed suburban splendor. Do you know how many D18s Martin made in 1954? A couple weeks back we were looking at that example from 1941 when they built 377. 13 years later they'd raised the production levels to 547. They made 170 more. Consider that for a second. The most esteemed and well-known guitar maker in the world, at that point every year is like a limited edition. This one is not what the boutique online dealers would call clean. It's been worked on and fixed up and kept in the game. That's something to consider. You know, a good guitar from that era is on its third generation of owner, at least. You know, it will have been played continuously for 70 years. You can't expect them to be pristine. Stuff will have been replaced. Frets, they can't stand up to that level of use. Bridge plates will be worn down, there'll be cracks and stuff. And this one has had its body refinished in an attempt to deal with some side damage, some cracking. It was stripped and sealed, revealing what is mahogany's actual color. The shade of brown that we associate with all those mahogany Martins comes out of a can. The actual wood is more pinky toned, and it ages into sort of a pumpkin orange with, you know, hints of red and brown. And on the back here is something kind of wonderful. It's the outline of the state of Maryland. That could be a clue in looking for the provenance of this guitar. Someone probably remembers an uncle who had a guitar with Maryland on the back. This bridge is an issue. It's not original. It seems to be in the wrong location. The saddle slot has ended up much too close to the bridge pin holes. There's some fancy pearl dots too, which I immediately assume are hiding screws or bolts, as are found in various Gibson models, but they're completely out of place on a Martin, of course. The action is not great. It's 7.5 64ths on the bass side, just a hair over 7 on the treble, which some people can deal with. Most people would consider it too high though. And in this case, it's being helped along a little because this has been tuned down. It gets played in lowered tunings. It's currently in dadgad, so slightly less tension, slightly lower action height. If we were tuning it up to standard pitch, I expect it would probably be in the 8 64ths area. So, you know, neck reset time? Probably. The intonation on this guitar is not great, as you might surmise, based on where the saddle location ended up. And it's a good thing that the saddle itself is so low, because I don't think it would function at normal heights. The break angle for the lower strings is so extreme, it just goes straight down. Any taller and the bridge pins would probably slingshot across the room and into the eyes of a small child. So my mind is already gearing up. If it needs a neck reset, this stuff has to change as well. It's a whole cascade of things that need doing because it won't work if we just tackle one. A new bridge that puts the saddle in the right spot and is of a more normal height. That probably means plugging and re-drilling the bridge pin holes. You know, there's evidence around the outline where things have been moved around before. Who knows what horrors await us under the bridge. Hopefully it's not too nasty under there. This has got a blind saddle slot for a drop-in saddle. That's anachronistic. Martin was using through saddles up into the mid-60s. This guitar is owned and played by a musician who takes it on the road, which opens up some philosophical questions. Should I recreate a factory bridge from 1954? I gotta tell you, if this was a really primo example that was owned by like an investment fund manager who strummed it carefully twice a year in his basement music room, maybe that's the way to go. But really, this is a player's guitar that's going to get strummed and sweat upon, and sometimes players need an action adjustment. This thing is going to Europe shortly. There's no truss rod in these, of course. Strange as it may seem, knowing how to deal with through saddles is not really common knowledge. Your average Guitar Center employee or touring tech may have never seen one. This has been 65 years since they were, in common use. Raising and lowering the action is not quick or easy. And a lot of the time it involves making a new saddle, I'm thinking a drop-in is probably the responsible way to go in this case. I can make it long so that it appears more correct. More evidence that this is a real deal player's guitar rather than a collector's darling. The original nut has gone away. It's been replaced by something that, it looks too wide and kind of clunky. I think that has more to do with the profile shape than anything. I can probably make this appear more elegant. And in the past we've mentioned how frequently when the original open-geared tuning keys on these guitars started to get finicky, people will go out and replace them with some Grover Rotomatic sealed gears. These are exceptionally early. These are patent-pending Rotomatics, made between 1958 and 1964. So these may have gone on within 10 years of the purchase of the guitar. There's evidence here on the bass side moving towards the end block of several fairly long cracks which were repaired, and there's veneer on the inside running cross grain in this area, shoring it up. In the depths we can see that there's an LR Baggs pickup installed under the saddle area, but we can also see a bridge plate overlay of dark wood, and then a second piece in front of that, probably to make a level surface for the Anthem installation. Those overlays appear pretty thick. Looking at the neck block area above the battery bag, we can see a patch of wood between the popsicle brace and the block proper. This suggests reinforcement for cracks along the sides of the fretboard, or repairing messy stuff that happened in a previous release of the fretboard extension. Sometimes if you don't read the grain, the knife can go down into the spruce and pop out through the inside of the guitar. I guess the place to start would be to see if I can pry off the Anthem. Don't really want that in place while I'm heating up the bridge. I think these overlays need to go. They're a bit heavier than they need to be. Once again, I'm hoping they were installed to take up enough space so the string end wraps weren't extending up and over the saddle. Getting rid of them will probably also make the pickup sound better. With some concerted prying, they came out. This is a picture that's been taken in night mode to get better contrast, and you'll notice that behind the bridge pin holes there are several more smaller holes. What's weird about them is the circular mark on the wood around the hole, as if there was some kind of stop collar that was rubbing up against it, or maybe washers from a previous bolt installation. I don't see screws extending down into the guitar at this point. The bridge had been thinned down considerably, leaving the slot very shallow. There's hardly any saddle there at all, and what is there has a great big wooden shim attached to it. Just because I couldn't see screws on the inside of the guitar doesn't mean that there aren't some in there screwed into the soundboard. So I'm going to steam out these dots and check and see. Not screws, but there are wooden dowels. There's quite a lot of funny stuff going on with this fingerboard extension. It's pretty thin, and here's the telltale mark showing that the board was cut through as part of an old school neck reset. Fun times ahead. Here's a look at the old overlay assembly. These pieces are over 1/8 of an inch thick, which is too thick. Removing the bridge as per usual. The surface under there I could feel is kind of undulating and wavy and weird, and there's also the dowels to consider. Got to work around those, hoping that the bridge will just sort of pop out with them in there and not cause too much damage. Okay, I've mentioned it in the past, just how unwise it is to cut through the fretboard at the body joint. It was common practice, but it was stupid. The guitar wants to fold right there. Your little end grain glue joint is not going to hold. Bumps and twists appear, And, you know, now I've got to find fancy ways of repairing the repair. Here's what the joint looks like. The end of the dovetail socket has been completely filled with PVA glue. Like, it's full. And there's a bunch of trauma from the previous removal. Some chunks of what looks like maple and thin birch plywood have been stuffed into the shattered remains where palette knife went through the board, like I predicted. So in order to get the fretboard to hang together in one plane, hopefully, and be solid, I've got to cut another chunk off, starting at the 12th fret, with a very fine saw. This is a flush cutting saw. It's got a kerf of about 15 thousandths of an inch, smaller than the fret slot. And I want to be careful not to cut into the neck wood, so I'm checking frequently. Heated that up and pulled it off to get to here. You can see the top of a T-shaped metal reinforcement that Martin used up into the 1960s. I'm trying to dig into the glue a little bit to see just how deep it goes, hoping against hope that it was just sort of spillover from someone who used a lot of glue during the previous extension reglue, but no, it goes in there pretty darn deep. I'll drill some holes for the heat probes. In this case, lining up the drill bit with the edge of the dovetail is not very difficult because I can see it. Foam cutters from hotwirefoamfactory.com. I'm just giving it a bit of a wiggle. It's been soaking in the heat for a while. I can see something. First of all, there's a chunk of the dovetail which is not moving. And second of all, there's a chunk of binding that is. I'll go in there and try and separate that. Don't really want to tear the binding up while removing the neck. Neck came off. Now I'm picking off the glue, which is still kind of warm and exceptionally rubbery. And there's also a piece of veneer which was jammed in the top of the dovetail slot there. Probably trying to hold the neck apart and keeping it tight, but that doesn't usually work very well. I'll remove the old inlays and a bunch of broken wood. I'll glue the chunks of fretboard together, sandwiching a little thin piece of veneer which I've sized to make sure that the slot is going to end up around 22 thousandths wide. That way I'm not radically altering the fret spacing in the upper register. I just use super glue. Virtually all of that is going to get cut away when I put in the support patch. Got a metal straight edge clamped to my flat registration surface. It'll keep the two parts aligned properly while the glue cures. So I have to plug the holes in the top for a couple of reasons. I'm almost certain my new bridge is going to be a millimeter or two farther away from the nut to make the saddle position work. And if I don't plug the holes, the string end is just going to come right up through the top and rest against the bottom of the bridge, which is not good. The other thing is the bridge pin holes themselves are massively oversized. By almost a 1/16 of an inch. They're just about a 1/4 inch in diameter, which is just, it's too big. However, we have an odd hypothetical situation to consider. The bridge plate, I'm going to keep it. It's not in pristine shape, but it's functional, you know. However, if down the road I or someone else wants to replace it because it gets irretrievably damaged somehow, I want to make that at least possible. So I've made a laminated material to cut plugs from. The first layer on the bottom is maple, like the bridge plate. The other layer is spruce. My reasoning is it's possible to cut through spruce with the edge of a palette knife. It's annoying as heck. I mean, you're sawing forever, but it can be done. Not so with the maple. So if there's any discrepancy in thickness between the plug wood and the soundboard, I want the intersection between those two parts to fall slightly below the level of the bridge plate so that you'd be cutting through the softwood. I can't see that happening. Hopefully that never has to happen. In practice, you'd probably end up just prying the plate off the joints, so you'd end up with, you know, short little nubbins that you could sand off. Anyway, just thinking ahead. No surprises for the next person. So I cut 6 plugs and plugged the 6 holes. Let's make a new bridge. Shortly after World War II, Martin started using rosewood to make the bridges of their D-18 model. Previous to that, it had been ebony. I'm not using rosewood. I'm using a wood called Chechen, which is actually closer to Brazilian rosewood in most of the ways that matter than Indian rosewood, which is the more common alternative. It's harder. It has a more glass-like tap tone. Its specific gravity and Janka hardness and everything is a little more Brazilian-like. So I like it. And also it looks not unlike Brazilian, especially when it's aged for a year or two. My camera did not like the transition to the extremely humid conditions in the shed. Here I am putting a radius on the top of the bridge. Somehow I managed not to film myself sanding the wings of the bridge using my oscillating spindle sander. I captured this scintillating moment, though. I'm filling the saw kerfs on the edge of the fretboard with a mixture of ebony dust and glue. Now I'm routing a recess on the underside of the board, which is about 1.5 millimeters deep, to accept a plug of ebony which will bridge the joint and make it much stronger. You can see my little spacer strip of veneer in there. I'll plane and sand it flush. And then I'll glue the board back onto the neck. And lining things up with a straight edge. I'm going to route out the damaged areas under the fingerboard extension. I'll pop in a carefully fitted spruce plug. It fits really well. I can lift the instrument without any glue. I get to pair off the plugs in the bridge area. I'm sanding the bridge. One wing has been completely sanded all the way up to 8,000 grit micro mesh. You can see it starts to look like it's been finished even though it has no finish on it. I'll route the back outline using a template. I'll apply a couple of coats of Danish oil to the outline in the wings. I don't do the top yet because I'm going to eventually want to put a piece of masking tape on there when I'm laying out for the saddle. Hey, I can actually get into the neck reset. Pulling sandpaper. When I have the angle right, I have to tighten up the dovetail in its socket, so I glue a couple of pieces of mahogany veneer to the sides of the tenon and then sand down to the correct size, which requires a bunch of checking and resanding, etc. For instance, here we're getting close to the right fit, but the end of the heel can rock back and forth. That means that material has to come off up towards the top of the heel, where it's tighter than at the base. Eventually I get it so there's no rocking at all. The tapers are locked together. I need to position the bridge and mark its location. I want it perpendicular to the center line of the top and in a place so that the saddle is going to be in the right spot. Then I'm scraping and sanding away lacquer that falls within the outline. There's also a bunch of old dry glue here. It's very dark and foreboding looking. I need that clean from edge to edge so that there's a good glue bond. Because this is an old and rather undulating soundboard, I'm going to take the time to sand the underside of the bridge so that the parts mate together precisely. I've transferred the position of the outside bridge pin holes to the soundboard, and I'm drilling through now, backing up my work with a block on the inside so that I don't splinter out the surface of the bridge pad. Freshly prepared hot hide glue, glue on both surfaces, and a lot of it. I put a real lake of it on there because it doesn't hurt, and it helps keep things warm enough so that I have some time to position the parts before it starts to gel up and seize. I've got a couple of bolts, 3/16 of an inch in diameter through the outside holes. They fit snugly. I've also got positions marked on the tape on either wing so I know when it's in the right spot. Just got to give it a bit of a push and then get my clamps on. Aiming for a time of about 2 minutes total. Anything more than that and the glue will have gelled in a position where it's not going to actually glue things. After about 10 minutes, that lake of glue squeeze out becomes kind of gelatinous, vaguely snotty, and it holds together and comes off cleanly. I can just sort of peel it off with a little stick and then take off any other residue with a slightly damp paper towel. When everything is dry, I can come back and drill the rest of the pinholes. I'll saw the repaired fret slots to appropriate depth and reinstall the frets. I'll use a little super glue. I've marked out the location for the saddle slot. In this case, I've added a couple of pieces of tape to the leading edge of my router base plate. This is going to tip it slightly. There is some slight bellying on this bridge, which is likely to cause the bridge to roll forward, and this will counteract that by placing the saddle closer to perpendicular when it's under string tension. There's a whole lot of material on the nut that doesn't really need to be there. The strings were buried in their slots, so I'll dress off quite a lot of height and also work on the angle so that it's more aesthetically pleasing. That's a little more Martin-esque. These frets are low, they're small, they've been dressed before, and I'm just going to polish them. I fashioned a new saddle blank. I want these to be a good snug fit. Shaped it, sanded it, the usual stuff. One thing to be careful of when restringing these old Grovers: they can get very loose in a way that is not readily apparent until it's too late. So always check to make sure that the buttons are screwed on. Okay, finito. As far as this video is concerned, I still have to reinstall the pickup, but I'm not going to play this thing plugged in for you guys. Yeah, you can see I've got the new saddle here. It's long. If someone wanted to convert it to a through saddle setup, not an arduous task, just involves cutting about 2.5 millimeters of wood on either side and making a new saddle for it. Got it strung up with 13s because this is down tuned to dadgad. Ordinarily, I'd say guitars made, say, before the 70s, at this point, probably limit them to 12s, usually. Lower tunings can be thicker. And yeah, it's a heck of a nice guitar.